So in this video, we'll look at a couple of examples of main idea questions, big picture questions dealing with the main idea of either an entire passage or perhaps a paragraph within a passage. So that's our task, to identify the main point or idea of an entire passage or a given paragraph. Keywords that tell us we're dealing with a main idea question. Well, main idea, central claim, primary purpose, that sort of thing. Now, the correct answer to these questions could either be a summary of the content, of the main idea, or it could be a description of the overall function of the passage, such as compare two rival theories on the evolution of bird flight. And in this sense, we can note a bit of an overlap with the topic of the previous video, function or purpose questions. So if you're talking about the primary purpose of the passage as a whole, well, that's kind of a main idea question, kind of a function and purpose question. It's kind of an overlap of the two. In any event, your paragraph summaries, especially the intro paragraph, if we're dealing with a long passage, will give you a big head start in formulating your approximate answer. We want to be wary of or skeptical of verbatim answer choices, meaning answer choices that pluck specific phrases or particular words that happen to be really distinctive, like really long words, scientific words, that sort of thing. Because a lot of the times those are going to be decoys that catch your attention but ultimately turn out to be incorrect. We also want to be wary of answer choices that mention specific supporting details that may be factually correct. They're just not particularly relevant to the central idea. They're supporting details that support the main idea. They aren't the main idea itself. So we want to be aware of that distinction. So our strategy for these questions, again, we want to begin by consulting the paragraph summaries to formulate an approximate answer. And that's true whether the question is focusing on a particular paragraph or the passage as a whole. And go through the answer choices and eliminate any that are clearly wrong. Okay, so usually with these questions, there will be two or three that are somewhat clearly wrong. If you have a decent idea of what's going on in the passage, that will leave two or three that are kind of, sort of, maybe correct. And then we come back to those and examine those more closely. And we want to be careful about ones that are quote unquote half right, meaning a part of it is right, but there's some other part of it that's either not supported or contradicted. And also be careful about ones that mention a supporting idea as opposed to the main idea. Extreme words are also a red flag on these questions. Okay, first example. And we'll go ahead and read this because we haven't encountered this one yet. The work of English writer Aphra Behn changed markedly during the 1680s as she turned from writing plays to writing prose narratives. According to literary critic Rachel Carnell, most scholars view this change as primarily motivated by financial considerations. Earning a living by writing for the theater became more difficult in the 1680s, so Behn tried various other types of prose genres in the hope of finding another lucrative medium. In fact, a long epistolary scandal novel that she wrote in the mid-1680s sold quite well. Yet, as Carnell notes, Behn did not repeat this approach in her other prose works. Instead, she turned to writing shorter, more serious novels, even though only about half of these were published during her lifetime. Carnell argues that Behn, whose stage productions are primarily comedies, may have turned to an emerging literary form, the novel, in a conscious attempt to criticize and subvert or overturn for her own ends the conventions and ideology of a well-established form of her day, the dramatic tragedy. So the passage is primarily concerned with what? So we'll note here several different pieces of evidence that are relevant. First of all, it notes that her work changed, and it tells us how most scholars view this change. So that is background information. But we have this scholar, Rachel Carnell, who has a different idea, who notes that she did not repeat a certain approach in other prose works. That is, the approach of this novel that sold quite well. So that is giving us some evidence in support of this alternative view. So kind of alternative evidence. And then a further argument that she may have turned to this emerging literary form in a conscious attempt to criticize and subvert the dramatic tragedy. So the primary concern here is discussing an alternate view on why her work changed. In other words, challenging the idea that it was due to financial considerations and instead providing some support for the idea that it was more of an artistic choice, a creative choice. So with this approximate answer in mind, we turn our attention to the answer choices. So we're not talking about how her view of the nature of tragedy changed. Is it explaining one author's view of her contribution? That's close, so we wouldn't want to eliminate that one just yet. We'll come back and examine it more closely. They're not differentiating between the early and late literary works. Is it contrasting the approaches taken to tragedy by Ben and Dryden? We don't see Dryden here. That's something that would come in later in the passage, but it's not supported in this paragraph for sure. Presenting one scholar's explanation for a major development in Ben's literary career. Well, one scholar, Harnell, explanation for a major development, meaning this turn towards the novel. That seems pretty good, but let's check the others. So explaining one author's views of her contribution, is it really discussing her contribution to the development of the novel? Not so much. It's not saying really what it was about her novel writing that contributed to the development of the novel as an art form. It's providing an explanation for a major development, her shift from writing plays to writing prose narratives. So it's providing one scholar's explanation for that. And so that will be our correct answer. Let's look at a second example. And again, we'll need to read this because we haven't encountered this passage yet. Upwards of 1 billion stars in our galaxy have burnt up their internal energy sources and so can no longer produce the heat that a star needs to oppose the inward force of gravity. These stars, of more than a few solar masses, evolve, in general, much more rapidly than does a star like the Sun. Moreover, it is just these more massive stars whose collapse does not halt at intermediate stages, that is, as white dwarfs or neutron stars. Instead, the collapse continues until a singularity, an infinitely dense concentration of matter, is reached. It would be wonderful to observe a singularity and obtain direct evidence of the undoubtedly bizarre phenomena that occur near one. Unfortunately, in most cases, a distant observer cannot see the singularity. Outgoing light rays are dragged back by gravity so forcefully that even if they could start out within a few kilometers of the singularity, they would end up in the singularity itself. Okay, so key ideas here. They're describing this process that concludes in a singularity being reached. And it says here that it would be wonderful to observe a singularity, but unfortunately, they can't be observed. So it's explaining why it's difficult to observe them, how they form and why it's difficult to observe them. So we turn our attention to the answer choices. Describe the formation and nature of singularities, so we don't want to eliminate that one. Explain why large numbers of stars become singularities. It's not explaining why. Compare the characteristics of singularities with those of stars. No, it mentions stars, but that's not a primary purpose. It just mentions them in passing. Explain what happens during the stages of a singularity's formation. No, not really. If that were the primary purpose, we would expect to see more emphasis on the sequence. First this happens, then this other thing happens. Imply that they could be more easily studied if observers could get close to them. Well, that might be tempting, but what it says here is that even if they could get close, they would end up in the singularity itself, which would mean they would not be able to observe them. They would get sucked in. So that brings us back to this. Describe the formation. Now, what about the nature of them? Well, we can interpret that in this context, the idea that they are difficult to observe, difficult if not impossible to observe. So we note that that didn't seem like it was 100% dead on right at first, but we wanted to examine it more closely. We come back and examine it, especially given that we're able to eliminate the other options. We can see, okay, the nature does match up with what we had initially formulated as an approximate answer. So that'll do it for the main idea questions. And the next one we'll look at vocabulary in context questions.